Okay, good morning. This is Richard Hsu, host of Hsu Untied, and this morning I'm really pleased and honored to have with me as my guest Andy Thorpe, who's a partner at Gunderson Dettmer. Andy, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Richard. Happy to be here.
So, Andy, you have one of the more unusual backgrounds of the many lawyers I've interviewed in the sense that you went to the SEC straight out of law school. So, let me start by asking you, what motivated you or what made you decide to make that decision?
Well, first and foremost, my father actually worked for the Division of Enforcement in the 70s. So I've
Oh.
always had in the back of my head, how the SEC is, a great place to kind of learn the law. I always had an interest in economics and corporate finance, and, thought, hey, starting at the SEC is kind of like a clerkship for corporate and securities lawyers. So
Right.
instead of doing the first year, you know, back in the day before they had electronic data rooms, being flown off to Akron, Ohio, to go in an actual data room for diligence, I was, sort of working at a little bit higher level, actually digging into the law, to the disclosure requirements, to the IPO process. So I viewed kind of the SEC as like a clerkship for corporate lawyers. I planned to stay there for 3 years, but I ended up staying, twice that long because of all the opportunities I had there.
Yeah, interesting. Does the SEC hire many fresh law school graduates? I wasn't the impression that they do.
Not anymore. They back in, the 90s and early 2000s, they did hire directly out of law school.
I see.
And then I think, the funding was reduced for the SEC. They started hiring more, and actually they got a lot more applications of seasoned, you know,
Mm,
lawyers at big firms
mm.
that wanted to go back and work, in the government. And so, yeah, I don't think that I was sort of in the last group of lawyers they hired straight out of law school. And it is interesting to see, how well the people I started with are doing. So I recommend anyone who can to seriously consider, spending some time in the government,
Yeah, interesting.
because it's just a great launching off point.
Totally. Well, tell me what you did at the SEC and how you liked it.
Yeah, so I started out in 1999 in the Division of Corporation Finance. And basically, I was in what they called the operations group now at that point. And so I was assigned to an industry group, which was the pharmaceutical, healthcare, and insurance group.
Hmm.
And day one, I was sat at my desk, and they plopped down an S1 in front of me, and they said, "Write a comment letter." So that was sort of my. So basically, what I did was I was the guy writing those comment letters, and now that I'm on this side of the table, I have a little bit of guilt for some of the comments I'd written when I was a young, buck learning learning the law. So I spent about a year and a half. It was interesting because it was right at the sort of the time the human genome was coded,
Hmm.
and basically biotech was being born. And so I was in the right group at the right time. So I had there were just a ton
Hmm.
of IPOs in the late 90s, early 2000s. And yeah, so I was the guy, reading the disclosure and, sort of figuring out, they said this in the financial statements, they said this in the business section, that doesn't make sense, please clarify. So we would
Hmm.
write these, 150 comment letters. Nowadays, if you get 30 comments, that's on the high end. But back, when I was there, 100 to 150 was
Wow.
not uncommon.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, so I spent about a year and a half in doing that. And I mean, honestly, my timing was pretty impeccable. They opened up a new office of rulemaking in the Division of Corporation Finance, and there were like 7 sort of positions open, and I had applied to that office
Hmm.
because I'd always when I was reviewing filings, in the back of my head, I'm always wondering, like, why are we making companies do this? Why is the rule written this way? What behavior is this trying to address?
Mm.
And I actually spent a lot of time like going down to the SEC archives back in the old building. They had a basement that was basically an enormous library, and you could dig up old memos, you could dig up old treatises, and so I was always interested in the policy behind the rules and sort of the history of the securities laws. And so this Office of Rulemaking job opened up. I applied for it. There's interesting story about basically at the same time I applied for that. It was like 2000, late 2000, and basically I had just gotten transferred from healthcare into telecom, and telecom was like the hot group.
Yeah, right.
But between like the 3 months so I actually tried to take my resume out of the rulemaking office pile because I'm like, oh, I just got into the telecom group. That's where all the action is. And the associate director at the time said, no, Andy, just leave your resume and see what happens. And by the time they got through the hiring process, the market had crashed. Telecom was just dead. And I ended up getting the position in the Office of Rulemaking. So despite my best efforts, I still was able to get this great opportunity. And it just so happened that, telecom was dead, WorldCom, Enron happened. I was in the Office of Rulemaking right as, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act came out that said, hey, SEC, write these rules. You have 9 months to write these rules. And there were like 7 young lawyers in this group. And I was 26 years old, and I was basically given this opportunity to sort of rewrite what it means to be a public company today. And so I, again, just the right place, right time.
Yeah.
Had the right supporters in Corp Fin, and then I just put my head down and went to work. Worked as hard as I could, learned as much as I could. And had, obviously some great supervisors and people, commenting and shaping the rules. And we sort of, what they call the Division of Corporation Finance's most prolific rulemaking period. That's probably debatable with all the rules that are coming out now. But I think the rules that I wrote were sort of a little bit more welcome because there was sort of the major scandals of the early 2000s that led up to the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. So it was just so basically it was a whirlwind experience. Had responsibility beyond my experience level that I should have, but there was just no time to kind of rationalize it. It was and ultimately it was like we were just a bunch of troops going to battle, and everybody in the Office of Rulemaking had their roles, and we just put our heads down and got the work done. And then slowly but surely, the bureaucracy caught up to the rulemaking. So people realized, we can't have this 26-year-old kid making, all this, having all this authority. So kind of, I started noticing like, oh, the chief counsel's office is coming in and they're weighing in. So it was kind of interesting to see how the bureaucracy caught up with the rulemaking process over time.
Interesting.
So it's kind of, go ahead.
I was gonna say, so is that when you decide to go to private practice or something else, or you had always wanted to go back to private practice, or that was your plan all along, or what?
Yeah, my intention was to spend 3 years at the SEC, sort of do a quote unquote clerkship, go into private practice. That was always my goal. But then, so I ended up staying 6 years because of the Sarbanes-Oxley. So it was just sort of time to move on.
Yeah.
And I'm originally from Chicago, so I was looking at Chicago firms, but I got a random phone call from a partner at Morrison and Forrester, because I had spoken at a conference that he happened to be on the board of the organization that ran the conference. And so I was interviewing in January. It was like negative 17 degrees in Chicago, and was one of those, every now and then in San Francisco, you get like a 70-degree day in January. So I'm like, what? Why would I go back to Chicago? And also ultimately I thought, hey, there's really not a lot of former regulators that come out to the West Coast.
Yeah.
A lot of them stay in DC. A lot of them go to New York. I thought, and I had seen all the technology companies doing IPOs while I was in the division, in the operations group. So I thought, oh, this would be a great place to kind of, I would get exposure and work with the companies that are going to be the S&P 500 of the future. B, I'm going to be differentiated because there's just not a lot of former SEC staffers out here on the West Coast. And then B, the weather, and it's just a beautiful place to live. I kind of fell in love with San Francisco. So I decided, even though I had no connections, no family out here, packed up, moved my family across the country, and been 18 years since then.
So did your thesis bear out? Is that exactly what happened? Basically, be able to leverage your SEC knowledge and, achieve a successful private practice?
Well, I guess the jury's still out, but I think it's worked out pretty well. I mean, I seem to have done pretty well, in practicing law. And it was definitely, and we can talk about this, it was definitely, I had to transition from a regulator mindset to a deal lawyer mindset.
Yeah.
Which was, it's difficult. But ultimately, and then there's just so many more skills at play when you're practicing law at a law firm than just being a technical lawyer knowing the law, which is very important, but it's not the only thing you need. You have to be practical. There's just so many aspects to, you need to execute. You need to be a business developer. You need to be a manager. You need to, collect your bills. So there's so many different aspects to being a partner at a firm than you can get. So it was definitely an interesting and difficult transition, but I think my thesis did bear out, and I'm thrilled to be working with so many innovative companies.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And then just get the perspective, like knowing how is the SEC thinking about this. Like when they're writing these rules on climate change, what are they thinking about? And then what's the reality of what's going on in Silicon Valley for a venture-backed company that's been around for 5 years, that's growing super fast. I try and help the clients bridge the gap between what the SEC is expecting and kind of what the reality is out here. And so it's definitely been a challenge and exciting and very gratifying.
Well, tell me the kind of practice you have now at Gunderson. Are you, doing, are you focused mainly on IPOs, or do you work with startups or later stage companies? Give me a feel for the kinds of work you're doing now.
Yeah, I mean, right now, since it's the slowest IPO market in 30 years, not doing too much of that. I'm pretty optimistic that the worst is behind us, and 2024 is going to, have more activity. But I spend my time, I do. That's sort of the meat of the value I provide is helping companies transition from a late stage private company into an IPO and then beyond. And then I stay with the companies after they go public. So I do a lot of 34 Act work, a lot of, so reviewing their periodic reports, helping them with corporate governance issues, things like that. And, I do some M&A as it applies, as the securities laws, like the proxy statements, or, you could have a whole career on just trying to figure out when financial statements are required from a target company. So I advise on those types of issues. And, now and more, I think the 34 Act advisory practice is becoming, more important just because the SEC keeps lopping on additional requirements for what it means to be a public company.
Yeah.
So it's so I'm lucky enough to I think a lot of firms are built a little bit differently, which is they have the capital markets group, which does the 33 Act, capital raising transactions, and then you have a different group that does the 34 Act the reporting and the governance work. At Gunderson, the same group does both, so we stick with the companies.
Yeah, got
which
it.
has been, which I really enjoy.
Are there any former colleagues that you started with at the SEC? They're still there when you first started, or they've all gone on to do other things?
Yeah, no, a lot of them are still there actually.
Wow.
So, and that's nice because a lot of them are in very senior positions. So,
Yeah.
So Andy, let's see. So you've been in the government. You've obviously had a very successful private practice. Have you ever thought about at some point in your career going in-house and trying to be maybe a startup lawyer for a company or anything like that? Is that a possibility in your future?
I've been at Gunderson a year and a half, so I plan on staying here for the long term. I mean, I always find it to be interesting, especially, when you see people get in early at a company that becomes a major unicorn and they end up just knocking it out of the park financially.
Yeah.
That would be nice. But ultimately, I really do love, being a firm lawyer, and because again, I think there's different skill sets involved. I do enjoy rolling my sleeves up, digging in on issues, like actually executing a capital markets transaction. So, I mean, I have had a few opportunities to go in-house and even to go back to the SEC at a senior level, and I've always ended up staying in the firm. So that's my plan for the long term. And I think with AI we're going to see another wave of really interesting companies and really exciting sort of capital markets activity, and I kind of want to be here for that.
Yeah.
Well, Andy, I really appreciate your taking the time and sharing your story. It was really interesting how you went from the SEC to private practice. Congratulations on all your success, and thanks again for sharing it with me.
All right, well, it's really a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
This is Richard Hsu and Andy Thorpe. Thanks.
Take care.